Hello everyone, I'm Thomas McClinigan, the Education and Outreach Manager here at the Museum of the Aleutians, and welcome to Seward and Sea Change, a collaborative video between the Museum of the Aleutians and the Seward House Museum. In this video, we're going to give you a brief introduction to the history of and the changes to the Aleutian Islands.
Stretching between the North American and Asian continents, the Aleutian Islands currently support a handful of small villages and the largest commercial fishery in the United States. Towns in the chain, such as Unalaska, feel especially isolated in modern times, with high costs of travel, shipping, and internet. And yet, the Unanga peoples have been living in these islands since time immemorial. Traditions recorded by Vinnie Imanov tell that the Unanga peoples came from the west, coming from a land without winter and storms, but with constant, pleasant airs. However, in the course of time, quarrels and civil wars came, compelling the move east, constantly moving to avoid the crowding of other peoples, until they at last found refuge on the islands, settling each one by one. Thriving in a dynamic environment, the ancient Aleutian people developed sophisticated technologies and social behaviors. Their resilient adaptations allowed them to survive localized catastrophic events, whether they were geological, ecological, or social, as well as long-term climatic shifts. Their dependence on each other and their sophisticated, mobile, and reproducible maritime adapted technologies allowed them to thrive. The Unanga people are intricately connected to the sea. It is reflected in their traditions and values. The archaeological record, which dates back as far as 9,000 years, illustrates the resilience of this maritime culture across millennia. We see from this material evidence artifacts that reflect a diverse maritime hunting and fishing industry. People use sophisticated wood and bone working tools to make their ikyak, bentwood hats, harpoons, throwing boards, fish hooks, and other tools. To hunt, travel, and transport trade goods, the Unanga carved driftwood frames and covered them with sea mammal skins to create vessels that cut through the water, able to handle the rough waters of the Bering Sea. The ikyak is a single-hatch example. Hunters at sea wore bentwood hats or visors called chaguta, which helped them see better by shading their eyes and hear better by cupping their ears, and were often painted and decorated with sea lion whiskers, feathers, beads, and carved ivory. The multiple component toggle harpoons and throwing boards were used to hunt large sea mammals such as seals, sea lions, and whales. Keeping them safe and dry, the Unanga wore chigda and other clothing made from sea mammal intestines and sewn with sinew and woven to be completely waterproof. This way of life lasted millennia. Catastrophic change, however, reached the islands in the 1700s. Father Vinnie Imanov noted that Unangan shamans predicted that white men with strange customs would come and that all of the Unanga would become like the new arrivals and live according to their habits. And so they came. Russian maps illustrated parts of Alaska as early as 1710, but it was the expeditions led by Captain Vitus Bering and his second-in-command, Alexei Cherikov, in 1741 and 1742, that introduced the richness of the maritime region, especially the sea otter, to Russians anxious to succeed in the Chinese fur trade. Following this expedition, the Promosoneki, hunters and trappers coming from Kamchatka and Otosk, soon arrived in the near islands, Agatu and Atu. They soon extended their reach across the chain, at times establishing cooperative agreements, and at other times resorting to violence. Responding to unprovoked atrocities in the winter of 1763 and 1764, the Unanga coordinated an attack against the Russians, in what would become known as the Aleut Uprising. Close to 200 hunters from 4 ships were killed between Unangax and the Alaska Peninsula. Among them were Captain Medvedev and his crew from Unangax. Artifacts from that encounter were recovered from Unangax Island by William Laughlin in the 1970s and are now curated at the Museum of the Aleutians. The Russian response was brutal, swift, and cruel. Vinnie Imanov refers to those dreadful times and to the cruel acts against the Aleuts, acts which included killings and the widespread destruction of tools and other important items. The Unanga retained a certain amount of freedom, but soon reconciled themselves to the presence of outsiders. By 1799, all Russian activity was consolidated by a monopoly charter granted by Emperor Paul I, creating the Russian-American Company. The first manager of this newly created company was Alexander Baranov, who centralized Russian control in Alaska. The limited political independence which the Unanga had maintained up to this point was stripped away. Baranov implemented a forced labor system reflective of Russia's own serfdom, requiring each village to provide laborers of each gender. Following the devastating loss of life and tradition, the Unangan were assimilated into Russian socio-political ranking systems. And what emerged as Russia-America was extremely complex and unique in many ways from other areas changed by European contact, as Russian actions were initially focused on resource extraction and not settlement. Russia and America also saw the rise of mixed heritage individuals to positions of privilege, providing a link between Russian and indigenous cultures. Local people were trained, educated, and worked in middle and upper management positions in the community. Western technologies and values were introduced, and company stores were established. The Russians also changed the landscape through the planting of trees for construction and ship repair, which resulted in mixed success and whose effects can still be seen in places such as Sitka Spruce Park on Unangax Island. The most enduring change that came with Russia-America, however, is the introduction of the Russian Orthodox Church. Initially, the Russian Orthodox Church came to the Aleutians with the earliest hunters who baptized men for economic reasons. This paved the way for priests who arrived later. Much of the success of the Russian Orthodox Church was due to Father Veniaminov, later canonized as Saint Innocent, the first priest of Unalaska. Arriving in 1823, Veniaminov was a linguist and anthropologist who spearheaded the development of a written script for Unangan Tunu, the Unanga language, creating its first written works. Veniaminov recorded many aspects of traditional Unanga culture. Other important people include the first Unanga priest born on Atka, who was Father Yakov Netsvetov, now St. Jacob of Alaska, who served Atka and Attu in the 1830s and translated scripture into Unangan Tunu. Inokenti Shishnikov, also Unangan, served the Eastern Aleutians and translated the Gospels of Luke, John, Matthew, and Mark into Eastern Unangan Tunu. The conversion of the Unanga to the Russian Orthodox faith had the fortuitous result of preserving language and culture. Because the church focused on converting their faith and not destroying the indigenous culture, their missions were of a spiritual nature, not a political one. And so missionaries discouraged interference in indigenous politics or culture, allowing missionaries to find the commonalities between the systems of faith, such as the shared belief in the human soul, the correspondence of use between masks and icons, and the presence of a creator spirit. The church was also a moderating force in the region, advocating for the humane treatment of indigenous populations. The Russian Orthodox churches were a piece of the community where Unanga community members could be priests, deacons, and church leaders in the community. The Russian Orthodox Church was also instrumental in establishing schools, beginning in Kodiak in 1794 and in Unalaska in 1825. While the schools contributed to the creation of upper social levels, they also led to an extremely high literacy rate amongst indigenous populations in Russia-America. This literacy utilized 3 languages, each of which had a function in that society. In the Aleutians, for example, Unangan Tunu was utilized in everyday life, Russian was used for official occasions, and Church Slavonic was used in church. The importance of the Russian Orthodox Church can be seen in a casual glance at almost any Aleutian town, where the churches rise in the centers of communities as primary landmarks. As society in Russia-America continued to meld, primarily in economic, religious, and educational terms, Unanga members and leaders continued to be the backbones of those communities. Over the course of roughly 120 years, the violent intervention of Russia completely reshaped life and society in the Aleutians. Another wave of change would arrive in 1867. This wave was shaped by the decisions which were made thousands of miles away from those who it would impact. Let's learn about those decisions now, as Zachary Finn from the Seward House Museum tells the story of the deal done in the dark.
Hi folks, my name is Zach Finn, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator here at the Seward House Museum in Auburn, New York. Now, for many of our first-time visitors, before they go on a tour of this 205-year-old historic house and learn all about the family who occupied this space during the 19th century, their familiarity with William Henry Seward, who would serve as Secretary of State in both the Lincoln and Johnson administration, can be boiled down to two words: Seward's Folly, or the purchase of Alaska from Russia by the United States in 1867. And although the purchase of Alaska would become career-defining for Secretary of State William Henry Seward, as Thomas mentioned earlier in this video, as with the arrival of the Russians in the mid-18th century, this land transfer would have a seismic impact on the First Nation cultures of the Aleutian Islands, as well as Alaska as a whole. So for today's part of the video here at the Seward House, we're going to look at the political process, the jockeying, that occurred in Washington, D.C. throughout March and April of 1867, and how this territorial exchange that significantly impacted those living in the Aleutian Islands and Alaska was hashed out. But it wasn't even Seward, whose bust you can see beside me, who first expressed interest in acquiring Alaska from Russia. In his son's autobiography, Frederick Seward, who would go on to serve as Assistant Secretary of State in the Lincoln, Johnson, and Hayes administration, notes that United States interest in the Alaskan territories dated all the way back to 1846 or 1847, as there were certain sections of the federal government who hoped to expand the United States Pacific reach all the way to the Arctic Circle one day. However, guiding foreign policy at that time was primarily Southern interests, which eventually prevented this original plan from ever occurring. And that brings us to 1860. A year that saw William Henry Seward hope to fulfill his presidential ambitions, as he hopes to become the second Republican candidate to run for the highest office in the land, aspiring to become President of the United States. Now, at the same time, then President Buchanan has his Secretary of State, John Appleton, begin informal negotiations with Edward A. Stokel, representing Russia, and who's going to factor quite heavily into our story today. Now, these two gentlemen, John Appleton and Edward A. Stokel, began informal discussions looking at the sale of the Alaska Territory from Russia to the United States. And there were some initial estimates that the price of this territorial acquisition would cost the United States federal government $5 million. But as these informal negotiations are underway, a seismic political event occurs that will forever alter the course of American history. Although Seward hoped to become the second Republican candidate to run for the office, he ends up losing at the Republican Convention of 1860 to the gentleman behind me, Abraham Lincoln. And realizing what was at stake, Seward decides to campaign for his former rival, traveling throughout New York, traveling throughout New England, traveling throughout the Midwest, rallying the Republican Party behind his candidate. Of course, after Abraham Lincoln is appointed the 16th President of the United States, the Winter of Secession begins, and he turns to his former rival, William Henry Seward, to serve as Secretary of State. And upon the firing of Fort Sumter in April of 1861, foreign policy in the United States will be altered for the next years to come. As although Seward had expressed interest in territorial expansion, as Secretary of State, he's no longer able to focus on these ambitions, and instead his mission becomes stopping the domestic dispute of the American Civil War from boiling over into an international conflict. So William Henry Seward, who we can see sitting down here with a map on his lap, steps into the State Department at really an unprecedented time in American history. And despite some initial hiccups, which include floating out the idea of starting a war with Great Britain and France in the hopes that it might unify the Union back together with the shared enemy, as well as the Trent Affair, Seward does an impressive job navigating this unique time in history at the helm of the State Department. As no country recognizes the Confederacy as a sovereign nation, Seward's effort at the State Department leads to the Civil War not boiling over into an international conflict. Now, following the conclusion of the Civil War, at the same night, Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. An assassin is sent to assassinate his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, in his Washington D.C. home. And although Seward would survive the attack, he would bear the scars and the wounds for the rest of his life. And while recovering, he learns of the passing of his dear friend Abraham Lincoln, and of course the subsequent appointment of former Vice President Andrew Johnson to the highest office of the land. With this new administration, Seward steps into a completely different State Department than the one he leaves before the assassination attempt. Seward realizes that no longer does he have to prevent an international crisis, and we can focus on his vision of where he believes the United States is headed. And very early in his career, and certainly carrying over into the State Department years, Seward is interested in territorial expansion. It's not only Alaska Seward is looking to purchase throughout his career. He's eyeing Iceland, he's eyeing Greenland. He sends scientists there to investigate the natural resources in these areas, hoping to convince the Senate to support territorial acquisition. He's also interested in southern territories as he visits the then Dutch-owned Virgin Islands in 1866, stating that he's recovering from an ailment, but very clearly visiting the territory, becoming the first Secretary of State to travel abroad while in office, doing so in an effort to hopefully purchase it from the Dutch. Now, none of these territorial acquisitions come to fruition for William Henry Seward until in 1867, he'll be approached by a familiar name from earlier in this video, Edward D. Stokel, representing the Russian government. Now, although the American Civil War had halted those early negotiations, with support from Grand Duke Constantine, Finance Minister Mikhail Return, and Tsar Alexander II, D. Stokel, who you can see in this portrait done by Emanuel Leutze, whose hand is hovering above the Alaska territories, returns to New York City in winter of 1867 and begins his mission to get America to express interest in purchasing Alaska. And Seward's interest in territorial expansion was certainly well documented by this point. So with the backing of his government, Edward D. Stokel reached out to Seward through an unknown liaison, most likely Seward's close friend and political fixer, Thurlow Weed, to schedule a meeting with the Secretary of State. The two men met on March 11, 1867, and D. Stokel had been instructed by his government to not approach the conversation of a sale outright, and rather have William Henry Seward ask if the territory was available for purchase. So at this initial meeting on March 11th, many things were discussed, but ultimately Seward realized what was on the table, which is when he approached the subject of acquiring the Alaska territories from Russia, which is exactly what Edward D. Stokel had been waiting for. With that, things began to move quite quickly. The next day, Seward received Johnson's seal of approval to move forward with the negotiations, and over the next week, Seward began making serious moves. He turned to the 1816 negotiations and mentioned a price of $5 million to D. Stokel, who in turn proposed $10 million. Meanwhile, in anticipating a haggling process over the price, Seward approached Johnson's cabinet with a price range from anywhere between $6 to $7 million. Strangely, there was little pushback from Johnson's cabinet. The proposal was unanimously approved, and Seward and de Stokel continued in the haggling process, trying to discuss a price. The price eventually decided on was $7 million, although at the last minute of the treaty, it would be bumped up to $7.2 million by de Stokel. However, on Friday, March 29th, while playing whist in his parlor, de Stokel arrived and informed Secretary of State Seward that the Emperor had granted his permission for the sale, and the next day he was willing to see the Cessions signed, to which Seward replied, "Why wait till tomorrow, Mr. de Stokel? Let us make the treaty tonight." And of course, spurred by Seward's enthusiasm to not wait until the next morning to sign the Treaty of Cessions, here we can see the two entourages gathered together in the State Department working out the Treaty of Cessions of Alaska. The final price would be $7.2 million. The Treaty of Cessions would be officially signed between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. And here we can see not only Secretary of State William Henry Seward sitting down with the map on his lap, but also Russian diplomat Edward de Stokel, as mentioned earlier, with his hand hovering above the Alaska territories. We can see Charles Sumner, who would become an important voice in gaining senatorial support for the Treaty of Cession, and Seward's son, the Assistant Secretary of State Frederick Seward, sitting at the very end of the portrait here. Here we can see a bit closer, Chairman Charles Sumner of Massachusetts would become an important advocate in gaining support in the Senate for the Treaty of Cessions of Alaska. Although he was initially frustrated with the lack of transparency by Secretary of State Seward and failing to involve several key senators in the negotiations, after studying the territory, Charles Sumner soon realized the importance of the natural resources and again became one of the largest advocates for the Treaty of Cessions of Alaska. He held several closed-door committee meetings, and eventually the Senate was called together during an executive session to look at the Treaty of Cessions, in which Sumner spoke for 3 hours, waxing poetic about the prospects of Alaska if it admitted as a territory belonging to the United States. Due to Sumner's popularity and support, the United States Senate voted in favor of the Treaty of Cessions, 37-2, really overwhelmingly in favor. But while Charles Sumner worked with the United States Senate, William Henry Seward was busy as well, gaining support in his own way. And that is what's referred to as dining room diplomacy. After signing the Treaty of Cessions in the early mornings of March 30th, Seward would go on to host 4 major dinner parties over the next 4 weeks, inviting over senators while Charles Sumner compiled his research and prepared to present it to the Senate. These dinner parties were extremely extravagant and lavish, and visitors could expect to eat 12 courses of food, receive 12 rounds of drinks, and it is rumored that Alaskan furs and delicacies were served to these visitors for the dining room diplomacy sessions. It wasn't all entertaining and dinner parties for Secretary of State William Henry Seward, however. Just like Chairman Senator Sumner, Seward turned to the libraries and to the resources to learn as much as he could about the Alaskan territories. And he also sought to disseminate that information, not just with United States senators through dining room diplomacy, but also the American public as a whole, to gain national support for the Treaty of Cessions. Just like Charles Sumner, Secretary of State William Henry Seward turned to the books to develop an understanding of the natural resources and scientific importance of Alaska, and he set about disseminating information in several ways. As written by the Director of Education at the Seward House Museum, Dr. Jeffrey Ludwig, the most distributed pamphlet, Purchase of the Russian Possessions in North America by the United States, was used to gain support of the public. Seemingly an omnibus of facts about timber, minerals, climate, fisheries, fur, and other resources, the publication included plenty of spin. So Seward's research in these publications helped gain national support, as does Sumner's presentation to the United States Senate. So for a little bit, you see a pretty all-inclusive support of the Treaty of Cessions in the United States. But in 1869, after Seward retires from public office, there begins to be some murmuring, eventually Seward's Folly, Johnson's Polar Bear Farm, Seward's Icebox, become the referencing terms when looking at the purchase of Alaska. However, that same year that he retires in 1869, Seward makes a trip to Alaska, visiting the territory that he had been involved in purchasing, sight unseen, and it reaffirms his belief that this is something that's going to be defining for his career. In fact, after traveling the world, when he returns to Auburn to write a travel memoir and an autobiography, a friend asked him, "What's the thing that you'll be remembered for during your political career?" And bear in mind, this is a career that spans 4 decades, holds 4 public offices, sees him outlive 2 political parties. And to this question, Seward responds that the purchase of Alaska, but he adds a little footnote that it may take a generation or 2 to appreciate its importance. And that certainly proves the case as indicated by those nicknames. However, after today's discussion at the Seward House Museum, kind of looking at the political back and forth between De Stokel and Seward, the support of Sumner that proved so important to the eventual support of the Treaty of Cessions by the United States Senate, it's extremely important to remember that these decisions that were made in Washington, D.C. had a complex impact on people living in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. And as Thomas mentioned, there was already a rich history and back and forth with the Russians during this time. There were cultural exchanges that were deeply embedded. With the United States acquiring this territory, there would be more change. So we're going to turn this presentation back over to our friends at the Aleutian Museum. Thank you folks for going on this virtual tour of the Seward House Museum. And if you have any questions about anything we talked about, please feel free to reach out to me at outreach@sewardhouse.org. And with that, we'll turn you back over to the Museum of the Aleutians.
Hello, my name is Karen Mackey, and I'm the collections manager here at the Museum of the Aleutians. I might look familiar to a couple of you. I worked as an intern back at the Seward House Museum in around 2017, and I'm really excited to get to work on this collaboration between the Museum of the Aleutians and the Seward House Museum. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Alaska after the purchase of Alaska by William Henry Seward. So we're going to talk about Russian Alaska and then that's transition into Alaska being a U.S. territory. By the time the Russian-American company left Alaska, many Unangan viewed themselves as integral parts of the tapestry of Russian America. They had been educated by the company and had found roles within the company as navigators, company agents, clerks, and priests. In the beginning, the Alaska Commercial Company, or ACC, purchased the holdings of the Russian-American Company, or RAC, but within the first few years, they decided to build their own store, company house, and constructed a wharf at the end of the natural spit we have here on Alaska. The company looked to build their industry in the geographic areas where Russian Orthodox churches were already built. They noticed that large populations of Alaskan natives tended to have a Russian Orthodox parish, which were good central locations for a storefront that might serve the neighboring areas. Additionally, the ACC continued the practice of sending men on prolonged hunting expeditions, which would reduce the number of men able to procure food and sustenance materials locally, thus making the local population rely on the company for distributions of goods as well. The ACC's predominant business was the fur trade, mainly the fur seal trade with furs procured from the Pribilof Islands. On July 27, 1868, just as Washington D.C. had done previously, the 40th Congress extended the laws of customs, commerce, and navigation to Alaska without any Alaskan natives present. These laws specifically outlawed the killing of any otter, mink, marten, sable, or fur seal in order to protect the Pribilof Islands fur seals from decimation. The law devastated the Unangan people, who heavily relied on income from hunting otters and fur seals. Their meat was eaten, their throats were used to create boots, and the intestines were sewn together to make rain gear, commonly called the chigda or kemlaika, which is the Russian word for it. However, the Unangan were unable to continue hunting hair seals and sea lions. For the next 2 years, residents of Unalaska and the Pribilof Islands signed petitions calling for the ability to use their traditional hunting grounds. and on July 1st, 1870, a new regulation was drawn which leased the Pribilof Islands to the ACC for the next 20 years. With this new regulation, the ACC gained uninterrupted control over the harvesting and distribution of the fur seal trade, which gave them unchallengeable power in the Aleutian region. Practically all able-bodied Unangan men were active hunters employed by the ACC. After returning from a hunting party, the first thing a local agent did was review each man's catch against his indebtedness to the company, creating a cycle of forced labor for the Unangan people. However, many Unangan men were able to turn a profit during the early years of the ACC's lease. The economy flourished in the Aleutians, and the annual fur seal harvest income for the Pribilof residents guaranteed far greater income than any achieved by other residents on the Aleutian chain. As the economy boomed, the U.S. Treasury restricted the killing of fur-bearing animals to Alaska natives. However, white men skirted the law with a caveat, marrying Unangan women, which still legally allowed them to join the hunt. This new system created social strains as some opportunists married Native Alaskan women and enjoyed the economic success of the fur seal trade, only to desert their families and return to the continental U.S. with their profit. The situation was further strained as the new territory began allowing firearms for white men for protection against the hostile, and the ACC allowed them to hunt using these firearms. With the use of firearms, they decimated the sea mammal population and began to mark the decline of the ACC. This limited the Unangan men who hunted with spears from their kayaks. With the decline of the ACC, Unangan men turned to fox trapping as a way to earn an income in the winter when they were not hunting sea mammals. While the ACC was in the Aleutian Islands, more and more white men moved to the area in an attempt to gain economic advantages from the natural resources in the area. The Unangan people began to assimilate into American culture, but fought to keep their Russian ties. They remained steadfast in their devotion to the Russian Orthodox Church and continued to speak both Unangan Tunu and Russian. The Americans reinforced commercialization through the fur trade and introduced an education system that discouraged traditional language and Russian language, forcing children to learn English. Michael J. Oleska told us an Aleutian-based story from a school based in the Aleutians when he was a child. He made it clear that English was the only language that students were allowed to speak, and this was forced through capital punishment. On one of the first days he was in school, he saw two 6-year-old boys sitting in the front of the class speaking in their traditional language, and the teacher came up and slapped them in the face for not speaking English. It was very clear then that English would be the only language tolerated in the school system. Even if the students had not learned English yet, they were expected to use it or not speak. In contrast, Russian Orthodox Church schools encouraged the use of Russian language, but also worked in conjunction with the traditional languages. The Russian Orthodox churches wrote Christianity in traditional languages, so they translated the Bible into Unangan Tunu, for example, so that the Unangan could read and understand it. School libraries there also had both Russian and Unangan Tunu resources for students. By 1911, the decline and end of sea otter hunting by many people on the Aleutian chain left them without access to the luxuries that they had been accustomed to from the fur trade, which decimated the fur seal population in the geographical area here. The departure left many without a substantial income. However, Unangan men continued to hunt sea mammals and use subsistence methods in their traditional manner. Now, relying on fox trappings in the winter for additional income, the economic downturn would continue until the start of World War II, when once again decisions about the Unangan people were made by the U.S. government without representation or consideration for the people living on the Aleutian chain. In the decades that followed the end of sea otter hunting, Unangan society continued to change. The Russian school at Unalaska closed after the Russian Revolution ceased funding to the operation. English language became the dominant communication method. Although the institution of chief continued, communities became more and more subject to outside laws. All positions of power and authority were assumed by non-native persons. The Unangan people had more decisions made for them. On June 3rd and 4th, 1942, the Japanese bombed Dutch Harbor and Unalaska Island, while also successfully invading islands further west in the Aleutian chain. In addition, the Japanese took the villagers on Attu as prisoners. A month after the bombing, the U.S. authorities evacuated 881 Unangan villagers from 9 villages across the Aleutian chain. These men and women were herded from their homes onto cramped transport ships, only allowed at most 1 suitcase. The Unangan men and women from Atka were on the boat watching as U.S. servicemen set their homes and church on fire so that it would not fall to the Japanese. The Unangan people were transported to southeast Alaska and crowded into duration villages, which were abandoned canneries, a herring saltery, and gold mine camp. Their housing lacked plumbing, electricity, and toilets. The camps were in disrepair, neglect, and Unangan people lived in these camps for over 2 years, struggling to survive disease and the harsh mainland winters that they were unaccustomed to. Medical care in the camps was non-existent, and U.S. authorities were dismissive of the Unangan complaints. Overall, 31 Unangan people died at Funter Bay, 17 at Killisnoo, 20 at Ward Lake, and 5 at Burnett Inlet. At Funter Bay, death rates were over 3 times higher than they should have been due to the terrible conditions in their camps. As the evacuated elders passed away from illness and poor conditions, so too did their knowledge of Unangan traditions. After evacuation, Philemon Tutiakov reflected on his time in the camps, saying, "The overcrowded conditions were an abomination. There were 28 of us forced to live in one designated 15 by 20 foot house. There existed no church, no school, no medical facility, no store, no community facility, no skiffs or dories, no fishing gear, and no hunting rifles. We had to abandon our heirlooms and pets even before the evacuation." While evacuated and the impending invasion from the Japanese loomed over the heads of the Aleutian chain, the 1943 full fur seal harvest in the Pribilofs became a priority for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. A crew of 151 Unangan men from Funter Bay and Ward Cove were assembled on May 6, 1943, and left for the Pribilof Islands. Once there, the crew was expanded by 9 men from St. Paul who had been serving in the Army. This seal harvest was the largest on record at that point. However, these men did not enjoy the economic success that they helped to create. When attempting to recruit students from the Wrangell Institute, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was told that pupils at Wrangell Institute have an opportunity to make more wages than you will be able to pay the sealers. Others refused to join the hunting party because, after Atka lived again, would they be willing to go to the Pribilofs? The Unangan people were finally able to return to the Aleutian chain after over 2 years of forced evacuation. Some Unangan people did not return home, wishing to stay with their new friends and in jobs that could provide them with higher wages in the city. The Unangan people that did return to the Aleutian chain and Pribilof Islands returned home to see their homes and churches destroyed. Entire villages were wiped out, and Unangan villagers were forced to start over in a new village. 3 villages completely disappeared after the evacuation, and they included Kashiga, Biorka, and Makushin. This came as a complete shock to the Unangan people, who were further shocked since combat did not take place further west than Attu. For decades since the evacuation in 1942, the Unangan people worked to rebuild their home on the Aleutian chain. Many returned to their homes, and others relocated to areas that weren't destroyed, like Unalaska Island. The 1970s saw a new rise in the Aleutian Islands as commercial fishing in the Aleutians created another population boom to the area, as fishermen flocked to the islands from all over the world. Since the 1970s, commercial fishing has been extremely prevalent here in the Aleutian Islands. Fishermen have worked in the industry here, catching things like salmon, halibut, cod, crab, sablefish or black cod, and many others in the area. This boom in industry has seen another population explosion here in the Aleutian Islands. Many can view the commercial fishing industry in Dutch Harbor or Unalaska by watching the TV show The Deadliest Catch, which is based on the Bering Sea fishermen that work here on the Aleutian chain. Overall, the Aleutian Islands has a storied history of over 9,000 years of habitation from the Unangan people, who rely on subsistence ways. William Henry Seward understood the cultural resources of Alaska during his successful purchase of the territory, and the Aleutian chain has continued to cycle through the hardships, struggle, and forced assimilation by relying on the resources that the land has to offer. Today, Unangan culture is being preserved through systematic efforts of the Unangan people. There have been efforts to preserve Unangan Tanu. The Unangan community has continued their efforts in higher education, and the community actively participates in the economic development through the village and regional corporations. Traditional Unangan arts are celebrated and taught through classes and the preservation of accomplished artists' works. Unangan communities continue the incorporation of traditional food into their diet. Overall, traditional Unangan culture continues to be passed down from generation to generation through education, family, and summer culture camps that celebrate subsistence skills and Unangan arts.